The house felt heavier when it was empty. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it pressed against me, filling every corner with reminders of how often I was alone. The familiar ache was already settling in when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. My hand hovered over the counter for a second before I wiped it dry and made my way to the door. When I opened it, the cold evening air hit me, but it wasn't what took my breath away. He stood there, taller than I remembered, a duffel bag in one hand, his shoulders relaxed. His expression was easy, casual, but there was something in his eyes that caught me off guard, a flash of something I couldn't place. He stepped inside, and just like that, the empty house felt different. His presence filled the room in a way that silence never could. His bag thudded against the floor, and I watched as he took in the space, the same furniture, the same photos on the wall. Familiar, but no longer quite the same. I moved automatically, warming up some leftovers. He followed me into the kitchen like it was the most natural thing in the world. Plates clinked, steam rose, and the house filled with the smell of stew. It should have felt like any other evening, but it wasn't. He ate with the same easy movements I remembered from family dinners years ago, comfortable but older now. The lines of his face had sharpened, and even the way he leaned back in his chair felt deliberate, like he knew he was being watched. The warmth from the food spread through my chest, but it wasn't enough to quiet the unease stirring there. Memories of shared summers and childhood pranks tangled with the realization of how much time had passed. After dinner, I settled on the couch, wrapping my hands around a mug of tea, more out of habit than need. He wandered in a moment later and dropped into the chair across from me. The silence was no longer uncomfortable, it felt like something else entirely. The lamp's glow softened the shadows around him, making his expression unreadable. I looked away, staring into my tea as if it held answers. Memories flickered unbidden, his laughter echoing in the backyard, the way he'd grin when caught doing something mischievous. But that boy had been replaced by someone I barely recognized, and yet. I set the mug down, the sound too loud in the quiet room. My pulse was steady, but I could feel it shifting, an unspoken awareness settling between us. The house felt warmer with him there. That should have comforted me. Instead, it felt like the first unsettling step towards something I didn't dare name. The smell of coffee drifted through the house, pulling me from sleep earlier than usual. For a second, I forgot there was someone else here. The soft clinking of dishes was a jarring reminder. When I walked into the kitchen, he was already there, shirt slightly wrinkled, hair still messy from sleep. He moved around easily, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. There was a calmness about him, as if he belonged. The table was already set, 2 mugs, plates, and the coffee pot between them. I hesitated, but he didn't seem to notice. He poured coffee and slid a cup toward me without a word, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I sat down, feeling out of place in my own home. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the quiet. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly how I liked it. Small details that felt too intimate. He spoke about his work, the city, the constant noise that never seemed to let up. His words flowed easily, filling the room where silence usually lingered. I listened, more out of curiosity than politeness. There was a steady energy to him, like he was always balancing on the edge of something bigger. I nodded at the right moments, but my mind kept drifting. His presence unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. He didn't feel like a guest. He felt like something that had always been there, waiting. The morning stretched on. Eventually he stood, stretched, and suggested we get out of the house for a while. The idea felt strange. I'd grown so used to staying within these 4 walls, letting the world pass by. But something about his tone made it impossible to say no. We ended up at the local market, wandering past colorful fruit stands and the hum of vendors chatting with customers. I watched him move through the crowd, blending in with his easy smile and relaxed gait. I felt awkward next to him, out of sync with the pace of things. He grabbed a bag of fresh bread and tossed it into the cart. For later, he said simply, like it was already decided. We drove to the park after that. It wasn't far, just past the main road, where the trees thickened and the noise from town faded. We walked along the path, gravel crunching beneath our shoes. The conversation drifted between us, light but steady, like the breeze filtering through the branches. I didn't realize how much I'd missed simply talking to someone who wasn't wrapped up in deadlines and meetings. At some point he paused and looked out over the pond. His profile caught the sunlight, the calmness of his expression oddly disarming. He turned to say something, but I spoke first. "It's strange," I said, breaking the silence. "Having you here." He smiled, slow and knowing, as if he understood more than I was saying. The walk back to the car was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. When we reached home, the house felt smaller, like the walls were closer. I busied myself in the kitchen while he unpacked the market bags, setting the bread on the counter like a promise for later. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel so empty. But it didn't feel safe either. The familiarity of it all was starting to blur into something else. Something I wasn't sure I could name. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the living room floor. I curled up on the couch, pretending to read. The book lay open in my lap, but the words blurred together. My mind wandered too much to focus. He walked in quietly, holding a bottle of sparkling water he'd taken from the fridge. The soft hiss of the bottle opening made me glance up. He settled into the chair across from me, stretching out with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove. The quiet between us wasn't awkward. It was heavy. I glanced back at my book, trying to ignore the way his gaze felt like a tangible weight. The hum of the ceiling fan filled the space as the light outside shifted from gold to amber. I let out a slow breath, setting the book aside. "What now?" I muttered, mostly to myself. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the TV remote, flipping through channels without stopping. The familiar static noise filled the room, flashes of sitcom laughter, car chases, cooking shows, until he landed on a movie I vaguely recognized. The picture on the screen didn't matter. I leaned back, watching the muted colors flicker across the walls. Minutes passed in companionable silence. I could feel the couch dip slightly as I shifted my weight, trying to find some sense of comfort. Then I noticed it, his arm draped lazily over the chair's armrest, his fingers tapping lightly, almost absent-mindedly. Something about it felt deliberate. Or maybe I was imagining things. The room felt too small. I stood, smoothing down my shirt as if I needed an excuse to move. "Do you want anything?" "Tea." His eyes met mine as he shook his head. "No, I'm good." I lingered for a moment longer than I should have, then turned toward the kitchen. The cool tile floor grounded me for a second, but my thoughts wouldn't still. The scent of fresh bread from the market lingered in the air. When I returned, he had shifted to the couch. He sat at one end, arms resting on his knees. I hesitated at the edge, but he patted the cushion without looking up, a silent invitation. I should have said no. Instead, I sat. The distance between us was small, barely the width of a pillow. My heart thudded and I hated how obvious it felt. The movie droned on in the background, but the plot was irrelevant. All I could hear was my own breathing. His arm brushed against mine, so lightly that it might have been accidental. My first instinct was to pull away, but I didn't. Neither did he. The air was too thick with things unsaid, too charged with something neither of us dared to acknowledge out loud. I shifted slightly, just enough to glance at him from the corner of my eye. He wasn't watching the movie anymore. His focus was on me, quiet and steady. For a moment, the world outside the room didn't exist. The clock on the wall ticked, the ceiling fan hummed, but everything else seemed distant. He leaned in, barely, but enough to close the space between us. My pulse quickened, a rush of sound in my ears. I could have stood up, made an excuse, said something to break the spell that was wrapping around us like a net. But I didn't. When his lips brushed against mine, it wasn't hurried or unsure. It was deliberate, slow, soft, like a question waiting for an answer. For a second, everything else faded, the room, the noise, the weight of decisions. I felt only the warmth of the moment, the unexpected tenderness of it. Then reality hit like cold air after a storm. I pulled back, heart racing, breath unsteady. The space between us felt massive now, like the couch had expanded into a chasm. I couldn't finish the sentence. What could I even say? His gaze held mine for a second longer, searching, but he didn't push. He leaned back, giving me the space I didn't know how to ask for. The movie still played, oblivious to the shift in the room. I grabbed the throw blanket from the armrest and stood. "I should clean up," I mumbled, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded once, the motion barely noticeable. I hurried toward the kitchen, gripping the blanket tighter than necessary. My reflection in the window caught my eye, flushed cheeks, eyes wide, and the unmistakable look of someone who had crossed an invisible line. The sound of the TV droned on behind me, but I didn't turn back. The door to my room felt heavier than usual when I closed it behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall as if it could give me answers. But the questions were mine alone to hold. The moment had passed, but its weight lingered. I knew it wouldn't be the last. The morning light seeped through the thin curtains, casting pale streaks across the floor. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of yesterday pressing down on my chest. By the time the alarm went off, I was already sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the dresser. The house was quiet, but not in the comforting way it used to be. Now it felt watchful. I forced myself to move, to go through the motions. Shower, dress, brush my hair. Routine was my only defense. By the time I reached the kitchen, the smell of coffee was already in the air. He was there, leaning against the counter, stirring a spoon in slow, methodical circles. The sound of the spoon clinking against the ceramic filled the silence. For a moment, I considered turning around and pretending I forgot something in my room. But running wasn't an option, not in my own home. I cleared my throat as I stepped inside. He looked up, his expression calm but unreadable. There was no tension in his face, only quiet observation. I wished I could say the same for myself. I busied myself at the stove, pretending to care about the eggs I was scrambling. The air between us felt thicker than it should. I wasn't sure if it was real or if I was just imagining it. My hands shook as I reached for the salt, and I cursed under my breath when I spilled some onto the counter. "You okay?" His voice was steady but soft, cutting through the noise in my head. I didn't turn around. One word. That's all I could manage. Anything more would unravel me. I heard the scrape of a chair as he sat at the table behind me. I forced myself to breathe, slow, controlled, measured. Normal. I had to act normal. Plates hit the table with a soft clink. I sat across from him, careful not to meet his gaze for too long. We ate in silence, the kind that wasn't comfortable but wasn't hostile either. I watched the clock on the wall as if willing the minutes to speed up. The day stretched ahead like an endless road. I needed something, anything, to fill the time. By mid-morning, I'd cleaned the kitchen twice and reorganized the pantry. The silence became unbearable. I grabbed my keys and called out that I was going for a walk, not waiting for a response. The door clicked shut behind me, and I inhaled the crisp air like it could purge the chaos inside me. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the faint hum of someone mowing their lawn a few houses down. Birds chirped in the trees overhead, oblivious to the storm brewing in my mind. I walked aimlessly, my thoughts circling the same questions. What had happened? How did I let it? Why didn't I stop it sooner? By the time I returned, the ache in my legs matched the exhaustion in my mind. The house greeted me with more silence. I half expected him to be gone, but his duffel bag was still near the door, a reminder that this wasn't over. I found him in the living room, sprawled out on the couch with a book in hand. He didn't look up when I walked in, but I felt his awareness. It was as if he was giving me space, but never quite letting me forget his presence. I sank into the chair across from him, more out of habit than comfort. The sound of pages turning filled the air like a clock ticking down. The weight of unspoken words between us made my chest tight. I wanted to ask him why he was so calm, why none of this seemed to rattle him the way it did me. But I already knew the answer. He wasn't the one who had everything to lose. The room darkened as the afternoon light began to fade. Shadows stretched across the floor, lengthening with every minute. "I'm going to make tea," I said abruptly, just to break the silence. I stood too quickly, almost knocking over the chair. As I filled the kettle, I focused on the smallest details, the hiss of the water, the cool metal of the pot in my hand. But nothing could drown out the noise in my head. The sound of that moment replayed over and over, the quiet hum of the TV, the brush of his hand, the feel of that single line crossed. When I turned around with the mug in hand, he was standing by the window, staring out at the fading light. His profile was calm, but I could sense the weight of something deeper. I stayed near the counter, keeping the distance between us like a barrier. My heart was still pounding, though I did my best to hide it. The house, once my refuge, now felt like a place where time stood still. No amount of cleaning or walks could change that. I took a sip of my tea and kept my eyes on the window too, pretending the distance was enough to erase what had happened. But deep down I knew the truth, denial could only last so long. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut through the quiet. My stomach twisted before my mind could catch up. I glanced at the clock, right on time. He was back. The front door opened and I heard the familiar jingle of keys landing in the bowl near the entryway. Heavy footsteps followed, the kind you only recognize after years of sharing a home. I froze where I stood, the tea mug cooling in my hands. When he walked into the room, he looked tired, his tie already loosened, his hair slightly mussed from the drive. He gave me a distracted smile, the kind people give when they've been away and want to believe everything's exactly the same as when they left. "You're home," I said, my voice too light, too rehearsed. He nodded, setting his work bag down near the couch. "Long trip. Traffic was awful." His eyes scanned the room, lingering for a second longer when he noticed the extra duffel bag by the door. Before I could speak, I felt him behind me, the presence that had haunted every breath of the past few days. He appeared in the doorway, holding a glass of water like it was the most casual thing in the world. "Hey," he said, nodding politely. My husband's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air. There was a pause, a fraction too long to be unnoticed. I forced myself to smile, moving toward the fridge. "I'll make dinner." "You must be starving." I didn't wait for an answer. I needed a task, something to keep my hands busy and my mind distracted. I heard them exchange a few words, small talk about the drive and how long he'd be staying, but I didn't focus on the content. My thoughts ran in circles, colliding with memories I couldn't afford to recall. I pulled ingredients from the fridge with shaking hands. My husband walked into the kitchen, standing closer than usual. He reached for a glass from the cabinet, his arm brushing mine. "You okay?" he asked quietly. The weight of his question pressed down harder than it should have. I nodded too quickly, offering a strained "of course." His eyes lingered for a second before he pressed a quick kiss to my temple. It felt mechanical, an old habit that no longer carried the weight it once did. I leaned into it anyway, closing my eyes for a fraction of a second, willing the moment to anchor me. For just that heartbeat, I tried to forget how tangled things had become. Behind me, I heard the subtle creak of the floorboards, the sound of someone leaving the room without making it obvious. Dinner passed in a blur of conversation I barely absorbed. I nodded, laughed at the right moments, and answered questions I didn't really hear. The three of us sat at the table like a mismatched puzzle forced to fit. He spoke easily, like someone with nothing to hide. I envied him for that. My husband, exhausted from travel, didn't notice the undercurrents. Or maybe he did and chose not to. After dinner, my husband disappeared upstairs to unpack. The moment the door clicked shut, the tension I'd been holding in my chest snapped. I gripped the edge of the counter and exhaled slowly, hoping it would make the room feel normal again. It didn't. I stayed there, unmoving, until the sound of footsteps returned. He stepped back into the kitchen, eyes scanning my face. "Relax," he said softly. "You're overthinking everything." I shook my head, but the words wouldn't form. I hated how well he could read me. "Go to bed," I whispered, trying to sound firm. He hesitated for a moment but nodded. I watched as he walked past me up the stairs. I followed after a minute, moving slowly, each step heavier than the last. My husband was already in bed, his breathing slow and steady. I slipped under the covers, careful not to disturb him. The room felt colder despite the warmth of the blankets. He shifted in his sleep, his arm draping over me in a way that should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like a reminder, of promises made, of lines that had already been crossed. I stared at the ceiling, the silence deafening. The weight of what wasn't said pressed down harder than the darkness. I was lying next to the man I had promised my life to, and yet all I could feel was the echo of something I never should have let happen. Morning crept in slowly, dull and gray. I lay in bed, listening to the sound of water running in the bathroom, the low hum of a toothbrush. His routine, always the same. He was out the door by the time I dragged myself downstairs, the faint scent of his aftershave lingering behind. The house felt hollow again. He was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a mug in hand. His posture was too calm, like he was waiting. The tension hit me before I even crossed the room, settling low in my chest like a weight. I busied myself, reaching for the coffee pot, but my hands wouldn't stay steady. The mug slipped, shattering across the counter in a sharp burst of sound. I froze, staring at the fragments. Glass crunched under his steps. I felt him close, too close. The warmth of his presence against the cold air in the room made my pulse stutter. The silence between us thickened. I cleaned in quick, jerky movements, but the pressure in my head only built. I had to move. To get out. The cold morning air hit my face as I stepped outside, sharp and biting. I didn't know where I was going. My feet moved without thought, following a familiar path through the neighborhood until I reached the small park at the edge of town. The pond was still, the surface smooth except for the faint ripples where the wind touched it. I stood at the edge, watching my reflection shift and blur. The breeze pulled at my hair, cutting through my coat. I closed my eyes and tried to slow the pounding in my chest. But the moment I found a sliver of calm, I heard footsteps behind me. Of course it was him. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence filled the air, tangible and unshakable. I didn't turn. My shoulders tightened under the weight of everything unsaid. The wind stirred the leaves at our feet, the only sound in the quiet. I waited, bracing for something, an explanation, maybe even an apology, but there was only silence. The pull between us was as steady as the current beneath the pond's surface. I took a slow step back, needing distance but finding none. The cold couldn't numb what was burning beneath my skin. He didn't move closer. But the space between us felt smaller than ever. I forced myself to look away, to remember the life waiting for me in that house. The promises I'd made. The weight of consequences that he couldn't possibly feel the way I did. The wind picked up, dragging strands of hair across my face. I felt a sudden sting behind my eyes but willed it away. There was no room for weakness now. I turned and walked past him without meeting his gaze. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like an accusation. His presence stayed behind me like a shadow until I reached the path that led home. But even as the distance between us grew, I knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The air inside felt heavier than outside. I closed the door behind me, the quiet thud echoing through the hallway. The house was exactly as I'd left it, too orderly, too fragile, like one wrong step could shatter the calm. The scent of dinner from the night before still clung to the air, though the table was empty now, untouched since morning. I pressed my hands against the cool surface of the kitchen counter, steadying myself. My breath came out shallow, uneven. Footsteps on the stairs. My pulse quickened before my mind caught up. He stepped into the room, silent, but his presence pressed in like a wave. I didn't turn. I could feel the weight of his gaze, waiting for me to acknowledge him. The space between us felt suffocating. I stayed rooted in place, staring at the sink, counting seconds that dragged too long. When I finally turned, our eyes met across the room. His expression was calm, too calm. There was no pretense now. The quiet understanding we'd been dancing around for days had broken free, raw and exposed. The floor felt uneven beneath me. I took a step back without realizing it, and his gaze sharpened like he noticed everything. My heart pounded so loud I was sure he could hear it. I needed an escape. The front door swung open before I could move. A sharp gust of cold air swept in, carrying the familiar sound of boots against the floor. My husband's voice called out, low but steady. He'd come home earlier than expected. The room shifted instantly. The pressure in my chest tightened as I turned, forcing a smile. He walked in with that tired, distracted look, the one I'd memorized after years of shared routines. He didn't notice the tension hanging thick in the air. Not at first. He kissed my cheek briefly, and the gesture felt like a reminder of the life I'd almost forgotten. I leaned into it more than I should have, like clinging to a lifeline. When he glanced up, his gaze shifted across the room, landing on the figure standing near the hallway. The moment stretched unbearably long. My husband's smile faltered, just slightly, but he recovered quickly. He greeted him with polite ease, brushing off the discomfort like a stray thread on his sleeve. But I knew him too well. I saw the way his eyes lingered a second too long. He was starting to notice. I cleared my throat and reached for something to say, but the words stuck, useless. The three of us stood there, caught in an invisible web. My hands felt cold as I set the kettle on the stove, focusing on the smallest, simplest task to keep myself from unraveling. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my husband glance toward the bag near the door, the same one that had been there for days. "How long are you staying?" His tone was casual, but his shoulders were too stiff. There was a short pause before the answer came, measured but calm. "Just until tomorrow." My heart sank, though I didn't know why. Relief? Dread? It was impossible to separate the emotions swirling inside me. I kept my hands busy, pouring water into mugs, stirring, listening to the clink of metal against ceramic like it was the only sound that mattered. The conversation at the table was surface level, barely more than noise. My husband asked questions, made jokes, even smiled, but I could see the quiet calculation behind his eyes. He was piecing things together without saying it aloud. When dinner ended, I cleared the table with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I could feel their eyes on me, the weight of both realities pressing down like a vice. Later, the dishes were done, the lights dimmed. My husband went upstairs, his steps slower than usual, heavy with something unspoken. I stayed behind, lingering in the kitchen until the quiet became unbearable. He was still there, standing near the window, hands in his pockets. The room felt like a trap, narrowing with every breath. I tried to hold on to normalcy, to pretend the fracture in the air could be ignored. But I knew it was too late. In that moment, the pieces of my life no longer fit together. By the time I climbed the stairs, the weight of the day pressed against me like a lead blanket. The house was dim, the evening shadows creeping into every corner. My husband had already fallen asleep, his steady breathing audible behind the closed bedroom door. I paused for a moment outside the room before moving past it, craving solitude more than company. The bathroom was warm and inviting, the soft hum of the vent fan drowning out the lingering silence in the house. I twisted the shower knob until steam began to fill the air, the sharp scent of eucalyptus from the body wash wafting up in soothing waves. I slipped under the stream of water, letting the heat seep into my muscles. My skin prickled as I leaned into the pressure, closing my eyes and letting the sound of water drown out my thoughts. For a few moments, everything outside the bathroom faded, the tension, the regret, the weight of unspoken truths. Here, at least, I could pretend the world was simple again. I reached for the bottle of body wash, watching the thick foam swirl in my hands before spreading it over my arms. The scent wrapped around me like a balm, comforting in its simplicity. The quiet was broken by a soft knock at the door, too soft to be real. My eyes snapped open. Before I could react, the door creaked open a fraction, and I heard his familiar voice call out, his tone casual. The knock had been more for show than permission. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slightly, the water still cascading over my shoulders. Through the steam, I saw his silhouette leaning against the doorframe. I could barely make out his features through the fogged glass, but I knew his expression, the faint smirk, the easy confidence that always caught me off guard. "You're really making the whole place smell like a spa," he joked, his voice cutting through the warmth of the room. "Is this a special kind of water, or just regular old rain?" I blinked, stunned for a moment by the absurdity of the comment. A laugh bubbled up before I could stop it, a genuine, surprised laugh that echoed against the tiled walls. "You've been watching too many food shows if you're talking about water like it's artisanal," I said, shaking my head as I grabbed more foam. "Now close the door before the steam sets off the smoke alarm." He laughed, a low sound that lingered as he pulled the door shut behind him. The latch clicked softly and the room was mine again. But the air felt different now, lighter, as if that small, ridiculous exchange had pressed pause on the weight of everything else. I stayed under the water a few minutes longer, letting the laughter fade into the hum of the shower. When I finally turned the water off, the steam still swirled around me, clinging to the mirror and the tiled walls. I wiped a hand across the glass, catching a glimpse of my reflection, flushed cheeks, damp hair, and a faint smile that hadn't been there all day. The house was quiet when I stepped out into the hallway, wrapped in a towel. His door was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling into the hallway. For a brief second I thought about saying something, continuing the joke, breaking the silence that seemed to creep back in whenever I was alone. But I didn't. Instead, I turned toward my room, shutting the door behind me with a quiet click. The calm of the shower had already begun to dissolve. The night pressed in around me, bringing back the same unanswered questions that had haunted me for days. As I lay in bed, the sheets cool against my skin, my mind wandered back to that fleeting moment of normalcy, the shared laughter, the ridiculous banter. It was so small, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things, and yet it felt like a crack in the armor I'd been trying to keep intact. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. But the quiet only made the memories louder. I woke before dawn, the room still bathed in shadows. The air felt dense, thick with everything unsaid. I stayed in bed longer than I should have, hoping the weight on my chest would ease if I just lay still. It didn't. The house was still quiet as I made my way downstairs. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly in the empty kitchen. I filled the kettle and waited for it to boil, the hum filling the silence. The familiar sound should have been comforting, it wasn't. When the tea was done, I took the mug and wandered to the living room. The sun was just starting to rise, the faint glow creeping in through the windows. I sat on the couch, tucking my legs beneath me, staring at the muted colors of the morning. I heard him before I saw him. Bare feet against the hardwood floor, slow and deliberate. I didn't need to look up to know it was him. His presence filled the room even before he sat down at the other end of the couch. We didn't speak. The quiet stretched between us like a fragile thread, too tight, too thin. I could feel his gaze, steady and unflinching, but I kept mine fixed on the window. The soft clink of my mug against the table sounded too loud. I wrapped my arms around myself, as if that could shield me from the storm brewing beneath my skin. The memories of the night before, his laughter in the doorway, the sound of the door clicking shut, played on a loop in my head. It had been nothing, just a moment. But it lingered longer than it should have. The morning light spread further into the room, turning the shadows soft and pale. I finally turned toward him, if only to break the tension that had settled like a second skin. He leaned back slightly, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I wanted to ask why he was there, why he couldn't give me space, but the truth was I wasn't sure if I even wanted that. Instead, I stood and walked to the kitchen, pouring the last of the tea into my mug just to have something to do. The warmth spread through my palms, but it did nothing to calm the shaking. I felt him behind me before I heard him move. The air shifted as he stepped closer, his presence wrapping around me like a shadow. I closed my eyes for a moment too long, gripping the edge of the counter as if that could steady me. I heard him exhale, a soft, slow sound that felt too intimate in the quiet of the kitchen. When I turned, he was closer than I expected, and the space between us felt smaller than it ever had. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. The room seemed to hum with something unspoken, a quiet pull that neither of us dared to name. The tea in my hand had gone cold. I set it down and stepped back, forcing space between us even though it felt like trying to break the tide. His eyes stayed on me, unwavering. I reached for the broom near the pantry, another excuse to stay busy. As I swept the floor, the repetitive motion numbed my thoughts. He stayed there, silent, watching. The sound of the bristles against the wood became the only noise in the room. I heard the creak of the stairs. My husband's familiar footsteps cut through the quiet like a lifeline. The tension shattered, replaced by something else: panic, shame, relief. He walked in, groggy but smiling, unaware of the tightrope I'd been balancing on. He greeted me with a kiss on the forehead, soft and absent-minded. I leaned into it like I needed it to ground me. He didn't notice the silence in the room or the way my hands trembled as I set the broom aside. He moved to pour himself a cup of coffee, completely at ease. When he turned and saw the two of us standing there, me by the counter, him by the window, his smile faltered just for a second. His eyes flicked between us, reading the room the way only he could. "Everything okay?" he asked lightly, though the question felt heavier than it should have. "Yeah," I said too quickly, forcing a nod. The clock on the wall ticked louder than ever. I reached for my mug again, the ceramic cool against my palms. The morning had only just begun, but everything felt like it was about to unravel. The house felt like it was holding its breath. The soft hum of the clock was the only sound, ticking away the final moments of whatever fragile balance had been left. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my empty mug, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. The front door creaked open. My husband's familiar footsteps echoed, deliberate and slow. I felt the weight of each step as he came into view, his eyes meeting mine across the room. He looked tired, not just from the day but from something deeper. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. I forced myself to stand, the chair scraping the floor as I pushed it back. My throat felt tight, words stuck somewhere between apology and fear. But he didn't ask for an explanation. He simply set his keys on the counter and walked past me. I followed him upstairs, my heart hammering with every step. The hallway felt longer than it ever had. When I reached our bedroom, he was already by the window, staring out at the fading light. The quiet stretched between us like a chasm. I wanted to close it, to find some way to pull us back from the edge. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though the words felt too small for the damage that had been done. He didn't turn. His shoulders tensed, but he stayed silent. I stepped closer, barely an inch, and caught my reflection in the window, my own eyes wide, pleading, haunted. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "What happens next?" The question wasn't an accusation, it was a choice. Tears stung my eyes, but I held them back. "I don't know." The weight of honesty settled between us. It wasn't an answer, it was the truth. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the silence between us wasn't suffocating. It was clear. He turned then, his gaze softer than I expected. There was no anger, only exhaustion and something that looked like understanding. "I need time," he said. I nodded. There was nothing else I could do. He picked up an overnight bag from the closet, one I hadn't even noticed, and paused by the door. Our eyes met one last time, and for a moment I thought he might stay. But he didn't. The door clicked shut behind him and the house exhaled. I stood in the empty room, the echoes of everything unsaid swirling around me. My chest felt hollow, but somewhere beneath the ache there was something else, a quiet hum of relief. Not because he'd left, but because the moment had passed and I was still standing. I moved to the window, watching his car pull out of the driveway. The taillights faded down the street until they disappeared completely. The house settled into stillness. Downstairs, the clock continued to tick, steady and indifferent. I sat on the couch, pulling the blanket over my shoulders. My fingers brushed against the familiar fabric, the one he always used during movie nights. The past few weeks had been like a fault line shifting beneath my feet. But now, as the evening stretched ahead of me, I realized something: the world hadn't ended. Not yet. For the first time in weeks, the future felt like something I could shape. Not easily and not without pain, but it was mine to face. The soft glow of the lamp lit the room in a quiet warmth. I let out a long breath and closed my eyes. Tomorrow would come, and with it, something new. But for now, I let the silence settle in and accepted it for what it was, a place to start again.